The year was 850. A series of ancient documents had recently been rediscovered and was circulating around royal and theological circles. These documents, which were allegedly from the first few centuries of Christianity, claimed that the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, had authority over all bishops, particularly regarding the ability to appoint and depose them. These documents were used as evidence that papal supremacy over other bishops was not only valid, but had always existed in the Church. There was just one problem, though. These documents were fake. Welcome to our series about the Papal Primacy, based on Klaus Schatz's book, the Papal Primacy. Today we will talk about the papacy's massive expansion of authority during the Middle Ages. Compared to the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Western Empire was largely isolated from most of the divisive issues in Christianity, especially when it came to heresy. This is likely because the East was plagued by power struggles between rival power centers, as well as corruption that came from the vastly more politically important Constantinople. Rome was the only major theological power center in the West, and though the Western Empire was invaded a few times, none of the invaders really seemed too interested in interfering with Christianity. In fact, they often converted and respected the Pope as the singular spiritual authority. To be fair to Eastern Christianity, the once proud and powerful Byzantine Empire was feeling some serious heat from the Muslims and felt the need to maintain cultural and religious unity, which meant compromising with heretics. Meanwhile, during the 8th century, the Western Roman Empire was at the threshold of being unified due to the ambitions of one of the most important political leaders in human history, the Frankish military leader Charlemagne. Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, recognized the unifying power of Christianity in the West, and made a deal with the Pope. He would give protection to the papacy if the Pope would recognize him and successors as the king. Charlemagne began his reign in 768, and in 800, Pope Leo III declared him the Holy Roman Emperor. His kingdom would span throughout Western Europe. Charlemagne sought to culturally unify his empire, so he worked hand in hand with the Pope to ensure that all Christian liturgies, including the Mass, were made uniform. The Church, specifically missionaries, was in full support of this. The missionaries in particular liked the fact that they could celebrate Mass the same way throughout the empire. With this unification of the liturgy, as well as the Pope's increased status as crowner of the emperor, came a centralization of authority to the papacy, and it was generally well received in the new empire. This was because powerful bishops throughout the empire kept abusing their powers, so the papacy declared that it had the authority to remove bishops. Like I said, this authority was generally accepted by the Western Church. Enter the false decretals. Around 850 AD, a bishop in France forged a bunch of documents which he claimed were from early Christianity. According to these documents, the Pope had always had the power to depose and instate bishops. Pope Nicholas I, who was a key figure in establishing this power, accepted them as legitimate and added them to the growing list of justifications for his authority. These documents, later labeled the false decretals, are what I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. We started the beginning of this series with a game of true or false. Let's return to that. True or false? The papacy invented these decretals for the sake of increasing its authority, so proving them as forgeries undermines the authority of the papacy. False. By the time these decretals were issued, the papacy had already centralized its authority over bishops. It's quite likely that Pope Nicholas saw them, believed they were legitimate, and moved on with his day. Think of it like this: one bad scientific study does not nullify a dozen legitimate ones that reach the same conclusion. Thus, it would be unwise, it would be foolish to say that the exposure of these decretals as forgeries undermines every other theological argument put forth during this time period. That said, one little white lie, even if it's in a sea of truths, can be devastating towards a community's trust, and the false decretals would come back to haunt the papacy much later in Christian history. We'll get to that one later. Anyways, the explosion of missionary activity during this time didn't just mean the Mass had to be centralized, rather all these new Christian communities needed some oversight as well. Additionally, some of the larger Christian communities, who used to exert oversight on the smaller ones, had been wiped out by Muslims. They needed Rome's guardianship. So, from the 9th century onwards, new dioceses in these territories required Roman approval for their formation. By the 11th century, Christianity, as the moral and cultural binding force of the empire, not only needed to regulate culture and the liturgy, but political affairs as well. This is a very similar situation that the Eastern bishops struggled with. Rome probably recognized how the Eastern bishops' demise was spelled by their constant submission to political leaders, so the papacy launched aggressive reforms to ensure its independence from power-hungry politicians. The Church even had a term in Latin for this quest for independence, libertas ecclesiae, meaning the freedom of the Church, specifically from subordination to a government. The power struggle between the Church and state would characterize the next 1,000 years of Christianity. Pope Gregory VII, who governed from 1073 to 1085, recognized that loyal families exerted too much influence over the bishops. So he claimed that Rome not only had the power to depose and reinstate bishops, but that Rome alone could appoint bishops. This was never legally codified during Gregory's tenure, but it is significant because it marks the first major effort to give the Pope such authority. Moves like these were embraced by parishes on the local level. In fact, Rome was overwhelmed by plights of individual Christian communities who were sick of corruption and disorganization in their own dioceses. Another big move during this time was the direct oversight Rome declared over monasteries. This was done because monasteries, whose purpose was embracing poverty and obedience, were often influenced and pushed around by their own local bishops. The centralization of papal authority over them meant they could take orders directly from the Pope, rather than from wealthy families in their communities. As the Holy Roman Empire continued to grow, so did the mobility of people across the empire. This growth meant logistical challenges that were tackled by Rome. Who would ensure that missionaries were doing their jobs, that pilgrims were being housed, and bad bishops were being punished? Rome. Consequently, who would ensure that roads were being built between pilgrimage sites? Rome. When universities, many which were founded by the Church, began supporting questionable theological stances, who would ensure they were adhered to the faith? Rome. And with hundreds of miracles being claimed by Christian communities all over the place, who would adjudicate which ones were valid? Rome. Before this time, local councils could declare someone a saint, but not anymore. Starting in the 13th century, only the Pope could declare someone a saint. Likewise, before this time, if someone was suspected of heresy, Satanism, or some other threatening belief, they were often tried by their local, possibly corrupt or incompetent courts, and worse, angry mobs. What did the papacy do to prevent this from happening? It started the Inquisition in Spain as a formal mechanism to try heretics in court. As a result, the Spanish Inquisition arguably saved a lot of lives. Here's my point. The growth in papal authority during this time did not come from a lust for power. It came from a necessity to manage a growing church in a growing empire. It came from a good desire to protect good Christians from abuse and prevent local Christian communities from devolving into cults that mindlessly killed anyone accused of heresy. Now, before anyone accuses me or Schatz of rose-tinting the papacy, let's address a very important caveat. Despite the papacy's best efforts to combat corruption, the amassment of political power led to a lot of abuse later on. The increase of papal power was effectively a double-edged sword. Here's how. The awesome power that the Pope wielded now meant a bureaucratically bloated papacy. Papal elections sometimes took over a year. The riches and glory that came with any sort of power led to a papacy out of touch with its flock, and the rivalries that came with such power meant the papacy made many enemies. And that's not to mention the dozens of popes during the Middle Ages that just straight up abused their power and engaged in unspeakable sins and deeds that are worthy of a series of their own at some point. Even the most well-meaning doctrines later had catastrophic effects. Pope Gregory VII, the guy who I mentioned restricted the appointment of bishops to the Pope, had also declared that the Pope cannot be judged by anyone, that the Roman Church is free from error, and that the Pope can establish new laws as he wants. He did all of this for the noble protection of his flock, but you can see how such power could easily corrupt popes with worse intentions. Pope Innocent III, who reigned in the 12th century, popularized the title that the Pope is the Vicar of Christ. As in, the Pope was not just the Vicar of Peter, but the Vicar of Jesus Christ himself. Now that might sound like a power grab, but actually, up until this point, the Emperor was commonly referred to as the Vicar of Christ. So again, this was a protective measure to ensure the independence of church from state. The next Pope Innocent, Innocent IV, arguably took papal authority to its peak in the Middle Ages, when he argued that not only can the Pope establish new laws, but that the Pope is above all laws, including church laws, and that he can abrogate and dispense any church laws he sees fit. This might seem like a radical move, but it actually was not. Okay, so it's time for a little political history. The Catholic Church's governance has largely mirrored that of its contemporary secular authorities. When Emperor Constantine divided control of the Roman Empire among his children in 337, it logically led to an empire controlled by various power centers. This basically instilled some sense of autonomy between cities, which was more or less mirrored by the early church's structure. For example, Alexandria didn't want Antioch touching its governance, both temporally and spiritually. The key point is that the church did not invent this system of collegiality between bishops. The church basically copied that secular system of governance. As we entered the Middle Ages, we saw feudalism replace this older system. Feudalism was far more structured and emphasized layers of authority, ultimately reporting to one major power. For secular society, this major power was the emperor, who mostly let his princes and lords do their own thing, but he still had authority over them. Likewise, the Pope structured his system of governance, but instead of princes, he had his bishops. Once again, we see that the feudal model existed before the papacy merely embraced it. During the High Middle Ages, in the early second millennium, political theory shifted from a feudal system to something highly more centralized. In the later Holy Roman Empire, the king was elevated to an involved unitary executive, whose power could not be questioned by his subjects. The emperor, according to common political theory at the time, derived his power from God himself, so it was generally accepted that he was not just a legislator, but was intrinsically above the laws of his society. Let's return to Pope Innocent IV. He observed this trend in political theory and embraced it. For if an emperor is above the laws of his subjects, then the Pope, as the spiritual emperor, must be above the laws of the church. And just like an emperor could not be judged by anyone, neither could a pope be judged by anyone as well. My point here is that the papacy's relationship to its subjects and laws did not occur in a vacuum. On the contrary, it looks like the papacy adapted to the changing political landscape. Had the papacy not adapted, perhaps the Western Church would have met a similar fate to her Eastern counterpart, in which secular authorities bullied the spiritual ones. The theologian Augustinus Triumphus, very medieval sounding, wrote in 1328, "Thus the Pope is the head of the whole mystical body of the Church, in a way that he receives nothing of power and authority from the members, but only exercises influence on them, for he is purely and simply the head." It seems that by this point the Pope was infallible and unstoppable. He could do no wrong because he not only proclaimed the law, but was above the law. However, there were two scenarios at the time that were generally accepted by theologians that could upend a pope's power. The first was if an ecumenical council, meaning a council of all bishops from around the world, ruled against him. The second is if the pope fell into heresy, and we will explore exactly how these concepts changed the trajectory of papal authority next week. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.